One minute, she was Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. The next, her title was gone, erased by the man who once defied the world to marry her. What could drive King Charles to strip Camilla of her royal title in a move so shocking it left courtiers gasping? This is the royal earthquake shaking Buckingham Palace to its very foundations. It began like any other morning in the palace, calm, calculated, wrapped in centuries of ritual. But then, a sudden ripple tore through the stillness. News anchors interrupted broadcasts, their voices trembling with urgency. "Breaking news," they said. "King Charles has issued a royal decree, removing Queen Camilla's title." Across Britain, teacups were set down mid-sip, and conversations froze. On crowded streets and in hushed offices, eyes turned to screens, struggling to process what they were hearing. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd began to form, drawn as if by instinct to the epicenter of this royal shockwave. The murmurs were immediate, and they were not kind. Some saw it as long overdue justice, a moment of truth finally breaking through the pomp. Others called it a cruel betrayal, a stain on the monarch's integrity. But behind the iron gates, the truth was far more tangled than the headlines could capture. For years, cracks had been forming between Charles and Camilla, hidden beneath carefully staged smiles and scripted appearances. Those who worked closest to them whispered about frost creeping into once warm conversations, about private disagreements that seemed too deep to patch over. To strip a royal title is no mere formality. It is an act that strikes at the very heart of monarchy. It signals not just disapproval, but disinheritance from the symbolism of the crown. For Charles to take this step meant something profound had shifted, not just in his marriage, but in his view of the throne itself. The move sent shockwaves through the centuries-old institution, forcing courtiers to reconsider the balance of power in ways they had never dared before. Inside the palace, aides spoke in lowered voices. Some claimed they had seen the writing on the wall for months, citing closed-door meetings that ended in silence, engagements cancelled without explanation, and an ever-growing sense that two visions for the future of the monarchy were clashing behind the scenes. Others swore it had come out of nowhere, an impulsive act from a king whose patience had been worn thin by something only he truly understood. And yet, for all the apparent suddenness, fragments of the past hinted at a long brewing storm. Aides recalled offhand remarks from Charles, quiet sighs during public events, moments where his gaze seemed distant, even as Camilla stood beside him. These weren't the signs of a split overnight. They were the scars of years of unspoken grievances, of compromises that had begun to feel like chains. The country stood divided, caught between disbelief and morbid curiosity. What could have possibly pushed the king to this point? Was it politics, personal betrayal, or a decision made for the sake of the crown's survival? The answer, as it would soon be revealed, lay buried in years of secrets, power plays, and a love story that had begun to crumble under the weight of its own history. But to understand why Charles acted now, we must uncover the events both public and deeply private that led to this unprecedented royal reckoning. They were supposed to be the great royal love story, two souls who endured decades of scandal to finally stand together at the altar. But the same fire that kept them together may have been the spark that burned their marriage from within. When Charles and Camilla were finally united in marriage, it was the culmination of a battle fought in the public eye for years, one that began in whispers and grew into a storm. They had survived media frenzy, family opposition, and the enduring ghost of Princess Diana. Their union was meant to be the moment where defiance triumphed over protocol, where love finally outshone tradition. Yet, from the start, the marriage was shadowed by a truth no crown could hide. Public forgiveness was conditional, and loyalty inside the palace was never guaranteed. In the aftermath of Diana's death, Charles faced an uphill battle to restore his image, and part of that campaign was legitimizing Camilla's role. He knew the nation was divided. For some, she was the woman who had always held his heart. For others, she was a living reminder of betrayal. Yet Charles was determined. With quiet persistence and relentless strategy, he pushed for her gradual acceptance first, as a presence at official events, then as a figure linked to his charitable work, and finally, as his wife. But even in victory, there were compromises. She would not be crowned queen, but Queen Consort, a carefully worded title meant to pacify the public and honor a promise that Diana's place would never truly be replaced. The media, ever watchful, played its own part in shaping their story. Photographs of shared laughter and choreographed appearances were crafted to tell a tale of stability, and mutual respect. But behind those carefully staged moments, old wounds still lingered. Camilla was not universally embraced by the royal family, and there were courtiers who quietly resisted her growing influence. Every public engagement was a balancing act between projecting unity and avoiding situations that could reignite old tensions. The palace machine worked tirelessly to maintain that image, but it was a fragile construction, built on years of political maneuvering and personal sacrifice. Over time, the cracks began to show. Camilla had her own views on how the monarchy should evolve, views that sometimes clashed with Charles's vision. He leaned toward preserving the symbolic grandeur of the crown, while she favored a more selective, strategically influential presence. It was not outright defiance, but subtle, steady divergence. These differences, small at first, became more pronounced with each passing year, revealing that their marriage, much like their rise to it, was built on compromise rather than complete alignment. Even in moments of celebration, the undercurrents were there: an offhand remark, a delayed appearance, a glance that lingered too long on unspoken frustration. What the world saw as a romance that conquered scandal was, in truth, a delicate arrangement balancing love, ambition, and the immense weight of public expectation. And as the years passed, that balance became harder to maintain, the pressure of the crown pressing against the fault lines in their relationship. Yet beneath the smiles and royal waves, an unspoken power struggle began, one that would soon spill into full view. Inside the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace, decisions are made in whispers, and every nod or glance can shift the balance of power. For Charles and Camilla, these whispers became weapons. What began as subtle differences of opinion soon evolved into calculated moves that shaped the inner machinery of the monarchy. Royal appointments, seemingly routine matters, became battlegrounds. Charles favored loyalists who had stood by him through decades of criticism, while Camilla began pushing for figures who owed their rise to her patronage. To outsiders, it was mere variation in preference. To those inside, it was the slow formation of two distinct factions. These divisions extended beyond offices and titles. Even public appearances became points of contention. Charles believed in maintaining the traditional balance of royal engagements, with every member of the family representing the crown in a specific, coordinated rhythm. Camilla, however, often insisted on championing her preferred causes, even when it meant disrupting the established calendar. Aides were forced into impossible positions, either risk the king's displeasure by accommodating her, or face Camilla's formidable disapproval. Each event, each decision, became another tug on a rope that was fraying fast. Over time, Camilla's network inside the palace grew. Certain staff members, particularly those in communications and charity liaison roles, began to align more closely with her. She offered them influence, visibility, and protection, ensuring they owed their loyalty to her circle rather than to Charles directly. She cultivated a separate rhythm of operations, with her charities and patronages running almost like an independent portfolio. It was quiet, it was discreet, but to those who noticed, it was impossible to ignore. William and Catherine, always careful in their approach, were not blind to these changes. Without confrontation, they began to resist. Their resistance was subtle, declining to publicly endorse certain initiatives, steering their own work into areas that bypassed Camilla's involvement entirely. It was a chess game played in plain sight, each move calculated to assert their authority without igniting open war. But in a monarchy built on perception, such restraint did little to hide the underlying fracture. Adding fuel to the fire were the leaks. Stories that conveniently bolstered Camilla's image began finding their way into sympathetic press outlets. These pieces often painted her as the steady, pragmatic force in the monarchy, while subtly questioning the king's judgment or suggesting that his health made him overly cautious. Charles, no stranger to media manipulation, recognized the pattern. And while he did not confront Camilla directly, the knowledge settled deep in his mind, planting seeds of resentment that would only grow. For Charles, the crown was not just a title, it was a responsibility that demanded unity at its core. But the growing sense that his own wife was building a separate court within his reign was not something he could ignore forever. The tension had shifted from quiet annoyance to a deep, simmering mistrust. But the power struggle was about to escalate beyond politics into the territory of personal betrayal. For King Charles, loyalty is the rarest of royal currencies, and when that trust was shattered, the consequences would be seismic. For decades, he had endured criticism from the outside world, confident that within the walls of the palace, His inner circle, especially his wife, would remain steadfast. But when whispers reached him that Camilla had spoken in private about his health and his ability to rule, the blow cut deeper than any headline ever could. These were not idle remarks tossed into the air. They were calculated observations, allegedly shared with individuals who had no business hearing them. Worse still, these words found their way into the ears of those who would see them as confirmation of their own quiet ambitions. The true rupture came not from idle gossip, but from a single document, an internal memo, quietly circulated among senior advisors. It outlined a vision for the monarchy's future that placed Camilla at the center. While Charles's role was diminished to that of a figurehead, it was not treason in the legal sense, but in the deeply personal language of trust. It was nothing short of betrayal. The king read the lines more than once, each time feeling the weight of their implication, that the woman he had fought the world to crown beside him may have been laying the groundwork for a reign without him. What made this betrayal all the more bitter was how it surfaced. It was not leaked by a disgruntled aide or a political opponent. It was relayed by foreign dignitaries. In a private exchange during a diplomatic gathering, one foreign leader made a passing reference to Camilla's comments, almost as if testing the king's reaction. The words were light, but their meaning was not. For Charles, it was confirmation that his own marriage had become a channel through which his authority could be quietly undermined beyond Britain's borders. This revelation came at a time when his health was already the subject of hushed speculation. Rumors swirled about his stamina, his ability to withstand the relentless demands of the crown. He had faced them stoically, but knowing those doubts might have been seeded by his own wife made each whisper feel like a dagger turned in the wound. Those closest to him saw the shift. His once measured patience was replaced by a grim resolve. Advisors, sensing the danger of hesitation, urged him to act. "If you don't take control now," one warned, "you may never regain it." And so, in the stillness of those gilded corridors, Charles began to make his decision. It would not be an impulsive outburst or a veiled warning. It would be decisive, irreversible, and public. He would do the one thing no one, perhaps not even Camilla, believed he had the will to do. This would not just be a personal retaliation. It would be a declaration to the entire nation that the monarchy was his to protect, and his alone. And then came the moment, planned in absolute secrecy, that would leave the world stunned. No press, no cameras, just a single private chamber, 2 royal signatures, and a decision that would shatter decades of history. Clarence House had seen moments of celebration, of grief, of quiet reflection. But this meeting would be remembered as the day the king crossed a line from which there was no return. The request for Camilla's presence was delivered not by a familiar aide, but through a formal summons written in the king's own hand. There was no hint of warmth in the wording, no shared familiarity, only the weight of authority that left no room for refusal. When she arrived, the atmosphere was unlike anything she had ever known between them. It was cold, deliberate, almost ceremonial in its stillness. The usual exchange of pleasantries never came. Charles did not ask her to sit. Instead, he stood behind his desk, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the document before him. For a long moment, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating, as if the very air carried the gravity of what was about to unfold. Then, without flourish or preamble, he slid the document across the polished surface. It was the royal decree, signed, sealed, and already witnessed, formally removing her title as queen consort. The words were precise and merciless, stripped of sentiment, echoing centuries of royal authority. It did not merely remove a title, it erased the public acknowledgement of the role she had fought so hard to claim. This was not a warning, not a suspension. It was final. Camilla's reaction shifted in waves. First came disbelief eyes, scanning the text as if she had misread it. Then anger, sharp and immediate, her voice rising in protest. But when she realized the decision had already been executed, her fury gave way to something colder. The anger fell into an icy silence, her expression unreadable. There were no negotiations, no appeals. She understood in that instant that the man she had once seen as her fiercest defender was now her most unyielding opponent. Senior aides, positioned just beyond the chamber, later described the scene in hushed tones. They spoke of Charles's composure, his voice even and unshaken, as if he had rehearsed every word. They recalled the stillness when she left no parting remark, no backward glance. It was as though the years they had shared had been reduced to a footnote, overshadowed by this single, irrevocable act. The decree itself was chilling in its simplicity. It left no ambiguity, no hint of future restoration. The language was clipped, formal, and absolute. In the eyes of the monarchy, her status was now indistinguishable from any other member of the royal family, without active title, a symbolic exile wrapped in the thin veneer of formality. But the shock inside those walls was nothing compared to the fury that erupted when the news broke to the world. The announcement hit like a thunderclap. Royal reporters, politicians, and citizens alike scrambled to make sense of the unthinkable. Camilla was no longer queen consort. Within minutes, every major news outlet had cut their programming, flashing the royal crest across the screen with urgent headlines. Anchors spoke with a mixture of disbelief and restrained excitement, their voices betraying the magnitude of the moment. This was not a quiet, procedural adjustment. It was a rupture in the fabric of the monarchy, a decision so rare that it demanded immediate explanation. But none came. The official statement was clinical, void of sentiment, and conspicuously brief. On the streets of London, reactions were sharply divided. Some cheered openly, declaring it a long-overdue move that restored dignity to the crown. Others were outraged, accusing the king of cruelty, of undermining the very stability he claimed to protect. The debate spread beyond Britain's borders, igniting conversations in cafes, on talk shows, and across social media platforms worldwide. The monarchy had once again become the center of a global storm, and Camilla's name was on every tongue. Inside the royal family, the response was far more controlled, but no less telling. William and Catherine maintained a poised silence, neither endorsing nor condemning the decision, allowing the public to draw its own conclusions. Princess Anne was seen only briefly, her expression unreadable, while more distant relatives avoided public comment entirely. The absence of support for Camilla from within the family was striking, and it did not go unnoticed by those watching closely. Then came Camilla's first public appearance since the announcement. She stepped out for a previously scheduled engagement, but the change in her demeanor was impossible to ignore. Gone was the warm, measured smile she typically offered the press. Instead, her face was set in a mask of defiance, her movements precise, deliberate, as if every gesture was a statement of resilience. She spoke little, but the air around her was charged with unspoken tension. Observers whispered about the possibility of a fracture not just in her public role, but in her marriage to the king himself. Speculation over the couple's future surged. Would Camilla retreat quietly into the background, accepting her new position? Or would she resist, leveraging her influence and connections to fight back? Rumors spread that private conversations between them had turned cold, their once unified front replaced by strained exchanges and separate schedules. For the public, it was no longer just a question of titles. It was a question of whether the royal marriage could survive the blow. The palace, sensing the danger, moved swiftly into damage control. Carefully worded press releases sought to frame the decision as a matter of streamlining and modernizing the monarchy. But these phrases rang hollow against the backdrop of such a dramatic demotion. Advisors scrambled to manage the narrative, holding off reporters, redirecting attention to other royal events, and quietly urging allies to avoid inflaming the situation further. Yet while the public dissected the drama, behind palace doors, the real fallout was only beginning. In the monarchy, titles aren't just honorific, they're weapons. And once Camilla lost hers, the alliances she thought she could rely on began to fracture. Friends who once championed her in drawing rooms and private dinners now kept their distance, suddenly wary of being associated with someone whose royal standing had been publicly diminished. Invitations that once arrived with predictable regularity now slowed, and conversations in aristocratic circles began to turn cool, their tone shifting from loyalty to polite detachment. The whispers in those corridors of privilege were no longer about how to support her but how to avoid being dragged down with her. Within the palace, the shift was equally stark. William and Catherine, long careful to avoid public clashes with Camilla, began to step into the space she left behind. Their schedule grew heavier with engagements once handled by her, their names increasingly attached to initiatives she had previously championed. It was a quiet, calculated transition, not a seizure of power, but a graceful assumption of duties that made it clear where the crown's future influence now lay. Public approval swelled around them, and in that approval, Camilla's absence was amplified. Princess Anne, the ever-pragmatic stalwart of the royal family, was another figure who made her stance known without a single dramatic gesture. Her quiet but firm backing of Charles's decision sent a clear message to the rest of the family. This was not a moment for dissent. Anne's support carried weight, not just because of her seniority, but because of her reputation as the family's workhorse, a woman whose loyalty to the institution eclipsed all personal considerations. By aligning with Charles, she signaled to courtiers and aristocrats alike that the king's choice was both deliberate and justified. Beyond the palace walls, aristocratic circles debated the precedent. To strip a royal title from a living consort was almost unthinkable, and yet here it was done, sealed, and irreversible. Some feared it set a dangerous example, one that could destabilize the monarchy if such actions became tools of political maneuvering. Others applauded the move as a necessary show of authority in an age when the crown's relevance was under scrutiny. But even among those who supported it, there was a recognition that the decision would leave scars. And in those shadows, the rumors began. Whispers that Camilla, stung by the humiliation, was contemplating revenge. Talk of leaked documents, private conversations shared with select members of the press, and secrets buried deep within the palace archives suddenly found their way into speculation. None of it could be proven, but the mere suggestion added a dangerous edge to her reduced role. If she could no longer wield influence through official titles, perhaps she could still exert it through information. Information the palace would prefer stayed hidden. The removal of her title had not just stripped her of ceremonial power, it had rewritten the internal map of royal influence. Loyalties had shifted, lines of communication rerouted, and the balance that had once allowed her to maneuver within the monarchy was collapsing beneath her feet. But even as her influence waned, Camilla still held one final card, one that could threaten the monarchy itself. If Charles thought stripping her title would silence Camilla, he was gravely mistaken. What she did next could either save her legacy or burn the monarchy to the ground. In the days following her public humiliation, she moved with a precision that revealed she was not retreating, but regrouping. Her first step was to quietly summon a select circle of trusted journalists, those she knew had the reach, the influence, and the willingness to print what others would dare only whisper. These meetings were discreet, held under the guise of private social gatherings, but the conversations were anything but casual. She spoke not of hurt feelings, but of matters that could shake public faith in the royal institution itself. Soon, fragments of sensitive information began to find their way into the press. Details about the monarchy's financial dealings, private expenditures, and even the strained personal histories of certain family members emerged in carefully crafted articles. They were never directly traced back to her, but the timing and tone were enough to suggest a guiding hand. For Camilla, this was not about petty revenge. It was about reminding the palace and the public that she still had power, even if it was no longer ceremonial. At the same time, she began a campaign to reclaim her public image. Every appearance was deliberate, every cause chosen to cast her in the role of the wronged yet dignified woman. She aligned herself with charitable initiatives that evoked sympathy, posed for photographs that framed her as calm in the face of cruelty, and spoke in measured tones that suggested she had been unfairly cast aside. Slowly, public opinion began to fracture again, not entirely in her favor, but enough to make the palace uneasy. Her reach extended far beyond British soil. Discreet messages were sent to well-placed friends abroad, political figures, philanthropists, and media owners, securing a network of support outside the monarchy's immediate influence. These contacts provided both a shield and a platform, ensuring that if the palace moved to isolate her, she would still have channels through which to speak and be heard. Then came the whispers of something even more dangerous, a televised tell-all interview. The mere possibility of such an event was enough to send shockwaves through the palace. The thought of Camilla, unrestrained and unfiltered, recounting decades of royal secrets in front of a global audience, was a nightmare scenario for the monarchy. It was unclear whether she intended to go through with it or simply use the threat as leverage, but either way, it placed her in a position of unsettling strength. Charles's camp, aware of the growing danger, began preparing countermeasures. Advisors drafted contingency plans, from legal maneuvers to rapid response media campaigns. The king himself grew more guarded, limiting contact and ensuring that every word exchanged between them was documented and witnessed. The battle lines were no longer hidden, they were drawn in plain sight. And so the stage was set, not for reconciliation, but for the most explosive royal confrontation of modern times. The stripping of Camilla's title wasn't just about a marriage, it was about the future of the crown. And now, the world is watching to see which will break first, the monarchy or the people inside it. In the long history of the British royal family, there have been scandals, abdications, and bitter feuds, but the deliberate removal of a consort's title by a reigning monarch stands apart as a seismic act. It was a statement of dominance, a declaration that no one, not even the king's own wife, was beyond the reach of royal authority. In the annals of royal history, such a move will not be remembered for its procedural legality, but for its symbolism. The moment the crown chose preservation over partnership. That choice has left the public divided in a way the palace has not seen for years. For some, Charles's decision was an overdue reassertion of the dignity and discipline the monarchy must uphold to survive. For others, it was an act of cruelty, proof that the institution is incapable of compassion, even within its own family. Outside palace gates, opinion polls reveal a deepening rift between those who want the monarchy to adapt and those who believe its strength lies in the unbending traditions of old. In drawing rooms, pubs, and digital platforms across the country, the question echoes: if this can happen to the Queen Consort, who or what is truly safe within the royal system? Internationally, the reactions have been just as pointed. Allies of the crown have expressed polite surprise in public, but in private, diplomatic channels have buzzed with speculation about instability at the heart of Britain's most enduring institution. Foreign leaders who rely on the monarchy's image as a symbol of stability now question whether this act signals strength or a dangerous fragility. Adversaries, meanwhile, see opportunity. For them, the image of a fractured royal household is proof that even the most polished of crowns can tarnish under the pressure of internal discord. Within the United Kingdom, the decision has also reignited questions about succession. With Charles's reign still in its relative infancy, speculation grows over whether this turbulence could accelerate the transfer of power to William. Supporters of the Prince and Princess of Wales see them as the embodiment of the monarchy's future, untarnished by the bitterness of this feud. Yet others warn that even a generational shift will not erase the precedent set by this moment, that titles, once stripped, cast long shadows that linger over every future decision. As for reconciliation between Charles and Camilla, the odds seem slim. Too much has been said, too much implied, and too much at stake for either side to back down without appearing weak. The palace may frame this as a matter of governance, but to those closest to the truth, it is deeply personal, and in matters this personal, apologies rarely erase the damage. Still, one truth haunts the entire affair. This decision has set forces in motion that no single decree can stop. The monarchy stands at a precipice, its next steps carrying the weight not just of tradition, but of survival. Every move will be scrutinized, every silence dissected, every misstep amplified. The crown has weathered storms before, but never one quite like this, because this one began from within. Because in the royal world, one truth endures once a crown is cracked, the fractures never truly heal. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.